Here is a video for the guys in the Asynchronous day or anybody who missed stuff in person over the stuff that we missed while I was gone. We got a lot of stuff to get through, as you can see, with our objectives. Here are our objectives for the day. We'll be able to apply our knowledge of covenants through the lens of typology to better understand the Old Testament covenants. We will be able to describe the strangeness of God's interactions with Israel. We'll be able to describe the story of David. We'll be able to apply the cycle of sin in our own lives. We'll be able to describe the fall of the Davidic kingdom. Here's our outline. We're going to start with Abraham, start with that thing with the animals. Then we'll go to Moses with the burning bush, the golden calf, the end of the Moses story, the judges and the cycle of sin. And then we'll go to the David, the story of David, and the story after David. So let's go ahead and get started. If you don't have it already, please go get the guided notes for this day on MySJ available to you. So going back to Abraham and the thing with the animals. Here we're back to Abraham. We see God do something strange in Genesis chapter 15. God has already promised Abraham a land, a people, and a blessing. In the blessing, God stated that Abraham's family would be blessed and that his family would bring blessings to all other families in the world. Remember, the Jewish people will be descended from Abraham, and Jesus will come from this line to save not only Abraham's family, but all families. These are some pretty good promises. Here's the problem from Abraham's perspective at this point. He doesn't have a land. He has no children. He's not feeling particularly blessed. So in Genesis chapter 15, we see Abraham express this feeling to God, a good model for our own prayer lives. And God decides to ratify the covenant with Abraham using a covenant formula that would have been familiar to him at this time. This is a treaty formula in which parties agree to terms. Then both parties each walk through a bunch of bisected or split in half animals. The image here that they're saying, if I break my end of the deal, let this happen to me. And it's sealed in blood. Now, here's the thing. That isn't exactly what happens here. Abraham prepares the covenant by cutting the animals up. He keeps the vultures away. And then something strange happens. God puts him into a deep sleep. Abraham doesn't walk through. That said, it is clear that Abraham is a party in this covenant. He prepares it, he protects it, and God promises him things in it. That's what makes it strange, even in this context that already appears strange to us. We see a flaming torch and a smoking fire pot both go through. Spoilers, but God's presence later on in the Exodus will be seen as a pillar of fire in the night and a pillar of smoke in the day. So God walks through twice. What does that mean? Well, God is saying, okay, if I don't live up to my end of the deal, let me be split in two. But if you don't live up to your end, well, I'll take that suffering and the consequences for that as well. I'll be split in half for you. Furthermore, all throughout this chapter, we see the word behold, which is like saying, hey, look here now. And it's all over the place. So we've got this blessing, this behold thing set a bunch, and God promising to be broken in two for us. Where else do we see that? Behold, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world. Blessed are those who are called to the supper of the Lamb. This is part of every Catholic Mass, and we see Christ broken as he was on the cross for us. The connections here are either a crazy coincidence or God is trying to tell us something. Let's run to Moses to see if there's anything else like that there. Now, the first time God comes to Moses, we see a great theophany happen. A theophany is a situation where God reveals himself to a person. And I'm not saying, you saw a pretty sunset and were filled with joy, not to discount God's hand in that by any means. A theophany is a bizarre and it defies natural occurrences. Hagar hears God talk to her. Elijah experiences earthquakes and storms. Moses sees a bush that is consumed by a flame, but not burning up, and God speaks to him from it. In this story, which we find in Exodus chapters 3 and 4, God reveals to Moses his name. Why does that matter? Well, sharing our names makes us beholden to people. We get attention with names. We sign contracts with names. We pass down and receive names. Names also denote identity. There are times when God changes people's names to signify giving them a new purpose, role, and or identity, as we already saw with Abraham and Sarah. The name God gives to Moses as his own is usually transliterated as the letter Y, the letter H, the letter W, and the letter H again. These four letters make up the Tetragrammaton, which literally means four letters. And this name, as it is passed down to us, can be understood in two major ways. When the rabbis got together, or didn't, if you believe the legends, to translate the Old Testament into Greek, a writing known as the Septuagint, they translated the name as ego eimi, or I am, or some variation of that. I am who I am, something like that. And that is what gets passed down to us even today. It articulates a very imminent and present understanding of God, this being which is being itself. This God gives reality to all of the universe and holds it in existence in all places and times. On the other hand, the actual Hebrew that we see here isn't related to any form of the verb to be. It doesn't seem related to any words we know from ancient Hebrew at all. This articulates at the same time a kind of transcendence, which means being so far above that it is totally different. Understanding the name of God doesn't actually translate to a word that makes sense, helps us to read this in a way that has God saying, you can have my name, sure, but you will not be able to understand me. I'm so far above you and so totally different from you that you will not be able to understand my ways. And I want relationship with you, so here is my name. Part of having trouble understanding God's ways is pointed out instantly by Moses himself. He's the first to claim that God should pick someone else. And he makes some very good points here. He's wanted for murder in Egypt. The Israelites do not know or like him. He has a stutter, so public speaking is not his strong suit. All these things. And God says not to worry. God knows what he's doing here. And Moses is right. By himself, on his own, Moses is the worst choice for this job. So why did God choose him? Because, and write this down, God doesn't choose the qualified, he qualifies the chosen. Because when Moses goes on to do great things, no one for a second is going to think that it's because Moses is so perfect and powerful. Moses won't even think that. It will be clear that it's God's doing. God picks losers and he raises them up to show us how great he is, not how great they are. This hurdles the story towards Passover, the ritual that commemorates the deliverance of the Jewish people from slavery in Egypt. Deliverance here meaning the concept of being taken out of slavery or being freed or saved by God. You guys covered Passover last year at length, so I won't take time to draw attention to other things. That's why I want to take some time to draw attention to other things, rather. After the Passover, the Lord has the Israelites go to Sinai. Here, God makes a covenant with the people. He gives them 10 laws, and they instantly break them. At this point, I hope we have some familiarity with the story of the golden calf. We see this story in Exodus chapter 32. A common misconception is the people have Aaron make an idol of another god. In fact, the idol that Aaron made was asked to make was one of God himself, the correct God. So why is God mad? Well, earlier in Exodus chapter 20, verse 4, God literally told them not to do this, not to make idols to worship, even of him. So they worship the right God the wrong way. It is good to mention here the idea of orthopraxy, which translates to right practice. It means the proper way to perform religious rituals and worship God. Have you ever heard people say, we all believe in the same God, we just worship differently? Or, well, you do this and we do that, but it's all the same God, so, who really cares? Well, who cares? God does. God seems to care about how he is worshiped. That doesn't seem to be about what is good for him, but rather what is good for us. See, because those worshiping the golden calf make that worship about their own entertainment. They're getting drunk and having an orgy and all sorts of stuff that isn't good for human beings to do. Hedonistic actions often lead to sadness and despair more than anything else. And so what does God have Moses do with the calf? Crush it up into dust and make all who worshiped drink water mixed with it. As a note, gold doesn't break down in the digestive system, meaning that they will be pooping gold for a couple days. God is saying, okay, you think that this is what I'm like? Well, here's what I think of your conception of me. It's crap, right? And if this gold is so important to you, dig through your own feces to reclaim your crappy God. Also, eating God. That's sort of a Eucharistic type, isn't it? It's deeply ironic, almost in a biting way, right? God's people will one day consume him and he will remain in them. When these folks consume their idea of God, it leaves them. There's also preparation here for these people to understand more of what God is really like, because one of these images are of God. And God is trying to prepare us for that. His love itself, is not the kind that says, do whatever you think will make you feel the most pleasure. It's the kind that says, I want you to be happy. And these empty things, they're trapping you. I've come to free you from the shackles that you choose because I love you and I want you to come home. I'm not the God of half measures or low stakes. I am the God of deliverance, and I will save you from your own sin. The rest of the time spent in the wilderness is a testament to God's patience and mercy. Whenever it gets uncomfortable, the people grumble against God. A trip that should take a few months takes 40 years due to lack of trust. Until at the end of this trek, we get to the eve of Israel's entrance into the promised land and the end of Moses' story. Moses himself also loses trust in God during the Exodus at a certain point, and God lets Moses know that this lack of trust forfeits his ability to enter the promised land. That said, Moses does get to see it. And there's a point to be made here that Moses has spent the past few decades probably feeling like a failure. Yet God shows Moses that he has, in fact, done what God asked of him at the end of his life. In front of him lies the promised land, behind him the people of God. And now his part of the story is over. It's time for the next generation to take the reins. And yet on the eve of their entrance to the promised land, there is a line after Moses' death that, quote, since then, no prophet has arisen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. This line is both to show the importance and impact of Moses in this grand story, and to point to a yearning for another, one who is to come, one whom does not simply know the Lord, but in fact is the Lord. After Moses, we hear about the first judge of Israel, Joshua, claiming the land with the people. This ushers us into the era of judges and the cycle of sin that we see there. I know that you guys watched the video on the judges already, so I don't need to spend time explaining all that stuff here. What's relevant for our purposes is understanding that the story of judges is best understood as a cycle of sin, as seen in this image. We see that this cycle starts with Israel serving the Lord, then falling into sin, particularly idolatry. When this happens, that is basically the people saying, hey, God, we think we're going to go over here now. We don't really need your help anymore. Have a good one. Bye. So God honors that wish, and the people are instantly enslaved or taken over in some way. Then they cry out to the Lord for help. He sends a judge, Israel is delivered, and they serve the Lord again. With each recurrence of this cycle, the people and the judge get worse and worse. For example, Deborah is an early judge. This is during good times, and all of Israel would come to her to ask for judgment on matters. She was holy and a fair leader who brought the people of Israel together under God. But closer to the end, we have Samson. He is called to be a judge of Israel, but basically just fools around with Philistine girls. Then there are battles. When there are battles to be fought, rather than bring the whole of Israel together, which is his job, he just goes and fights the army himself. In our world, that might sound cool, but his job was to keep Israel together, not to be a showboat. By the end of Judges, the tribes of Israel are doing the unthinkable. They are fighting each other and going to war with one another. This leads us into the story of of 1st and 2nd Samuel, where we meet David. Now, the story of David, I think, is one of the coolest in the Bible. I know you heard about this stuff earlier from 1st Samuel, but seriously, you guys should read these books. And I'm not saying that in order to do well in the test or anything, but just these are cool books to read. And they're all one story, as was told in the video you watched. They're all about what it means to be a man, a leader, one who aims to please the Lord. And they do that through an incredible historical story that lays out everything you could want to know by showing not only great triumphs, but also great failures. The video you watched showed you the juxtaposition of Saul, the proud, dishonest king the people thought they wanted, a man who was willing to appease God, but is in it for his own glory. Against David, the shepherd boy from the middle of nowhere who likes to sing songs. He earnestly seeks to please God. And this shows not only in his actions, but also how he responds when he fails. Remember now that David seeks to please God. Whereas Saul would check the boxes he absolutely had to, David would go above and beyond to glorify God. After David names Jerusalem both the political and religious capital, the ark is moved there. As it is moved, David dances and sings through the streets in what is basically his underwear. I think it's important to stress here that we sometimes think that there is a tension between charismatic prayer. In modern times, this would be praise and worship styles of music, and reverent prayer, which we think of as quiet and having a lot of ritualistic things and symbols like candles and incense and all that sort of stuff. This is a false dichotomy, and David shows us that. What David shows us here, right, is that there's a time and place for both. The loud and public rejoicing David shows is proper in its context. He's walking through a loud city and inviting everyone to look at the king who would make a fool of himself for God. That is both charismatic and, in its way, reverent. David is also a priest, so when he does sacrifice, he wears the proper clothing, he uses incense, says the prescribed prayers, and all the like as well. David shows that there is a time for loud, boisterous praise, as well as the quieter, ritualistic form. His wife and Saul's daughter, Michal, does not find his dancing through the street to be proper or dignified for a king, and she tells him off for it. After this, we hear that she bears no more children. Now, there are two ways you can take this. Michal has spurned her husband for joyful praising of the Lord, the God of life, and from that sin, the Lord refuses to allow her to be a part of procreating. The other way to see it is that David hears this response and is no longer able or willing to find her attractive. His main priority is the Lord over all else. Again, David makes Jerusalem both the political and religious capital. This choice articulates something important for us. For David in this era of the people of Israel, their political identity is completely entwined with their religious identity. Jerusalem is where they worship and where they get building permits. It's where they sacrifice and where they pay taxes to. It's all wrapped up into one. And at this point, David's life is going pretty well. So well that he starts to worry about whether he's giving God the attention he should. He wants to build him a temple, a house. And God's response is, buddy, let me build you a house. And God forms that covenant with David, which you guys went over in class. Now, it's also important to talk about this situation with Bathsheba, which is noted as the time that David messed up the most. Actually, it's sometimes noted as the only time that David messed up. Here are the main points. During a time of year that David is supposed to be out with the military on campaign, Bathsheba is bathing on her rooftop, and the king lives at the top of the hill. Now, David's supposed to be out of town, though, right? So she's bathing on her roof, and the king lives at the top of the hill, but the military is out at war, so she would assume that David isn't there. In fact, her husband Uriah is out at war too. David, seeing her, lusts after her, brings her up, and has sex with her, and he impregnates her. Knowing about this, David then sends for Bathsheba's husband Uriah, and Uriah, a Hittite, not a natural born citizen of Israel, but has become part of the citizenry of Israel, refuses to come home to be able to cover for David. And so what David does is he sends Uriah to the front line and has everyone else pull back right when the enemy comes upon them. So Uriah dies. And he takes Bathsheba, and Nathan actually is really important here in the story, right? But first, let's sort of look at what happens with David. In one understanding, Bathsheba might be seducing David, but it isn't very likely. In the other, David is creeping while he should be away at war. So David's either a creep and a murderer, or he's seduced, which is still partially his fault, and a murderer. Either way, David is not so great in this particular story. And then Nathan, the court prophet, comes up to David and he calls him out. He does this by means of a story. He says, he makes an example of, he's like, oh, well, you were a shepherd and we have this case brewing in the city. There's a really wealthy shepherd who saw that he had a bunch of sheep, and he saw a shepherd who was poor, who had just one little ewe, EWE there, not UYOU, and he murders that shepherd and he steals that ewe from him. And David gets enraged and he says, bring that man to me right now. That is a grave sin. We should put him to death for that. And Nathan looks at him and says, David, that man is you. And at this point, right, Nathan is standing there in front of David, who has guards around him, and he's telling the king, hey, you messed up. And David, as a king, could sit there and go, well, you know what? Nathan, I'm going to chop your head off then, if you don't like it. I'm the king, I can do what I want. But rather, David repents. David says, I have messed up, you're right. And he repents to the Lord. So David also shows us that even when you mess up, you make it right. That's what you do. Now, after David, we have the King Solomon, who's actually a son of Bathsheba. He's an okay king. He's actually not so great. He does this weird, so he taxes the people relentlessly. He builds a lot of pagan shrines. He marries a bunch of people for political gain, most of whom he doesn't really even meet. And he does this sort of as a way to consolidate power. But Solomon is known as a wise king. for doing all these things, and maybe not for doing those particular things, but just in general known as the wise. Solomon's son Rehoboam, though, is really not great. Rehoboam, when he becomes king, he has the option to make peace with some people who had rebelled against his father because they were taxing him too much. And that's what the counsel he receives is, hey, well, lessen their taxes and they'll like you and they'll come swear to you. And Rehoboam says, I don't really like that idea. He listens to his drinking buddies who say, hey, tax him harder, ha, ha, ha. And he decides to do that. So the kingdom splits because of this. And 10 of the 10 northern tribes split off in the north and become the kingdom of Israel. And then all that Rehoboam is left with is the kingdom of Judah, which contains Jerusalem, right? From here on out, a lot of bad stuff happens. There are a lot of wicked kings. This leads to the downfall of both the north and the south. The north is scattered to the wind by the Assyrians, and the south is taken hostage by Babylon. Now, this is known as the diaspora, where people start living away from their homeland. The Jewish people do, and they're sort of split up a whole bunch. It's during this time that the prophets become really important, both standing there to warn the people, and then after the Babylonian exile, they start communicating God's promises of what the people can expect from their God, who still does love them and who still does care for them. And that's what we'll be doing next time we're together. Have a good rest of your asynchronous day, boys, and I will see you next time.